We just. Yeah. I don't still think people listen, but. Okay.
Well, hello, everybody.
Hello.
How's everybody doing?
Good.
Pretty good. All right. See our usual gallery of rogues in here, which is good. It's nice to have a following. But for those of you who don't know who we are, I'm Jason Salagi.
And I'm Christina Corsalagi.
Okay. We do a lot of the OLLI history class. On top of being professors of history, pretty much at every regional community college, university that's around here.
Anywhere that'll take us, let us know if you hear anything.
Yes. But we are gonna today, or actually this course is gonna be set up as the Age of Alexander, so Alexander the Great. So we're gonna give, over the course of this 4 weeks, we're gonna talk about the Macedonian royal family. Okay, the Argeads, who are Alexander's dynasty. Well, he's part of that dynasty. We'll talk about, how Macedonia and the Greek world interact in the ancient world, because for Macedonians, they view themselves as Greek. For Greeks, they're like, oh, these are semi-nomad or semi-barbaric northern cousins. They speak a dialect of Greek, and they like to kind of ape us, but they're not really us. And then we'll talk about some of the other territories that are around Macedonia and Greece and how they interact. We'll give a brief introduction today of kind of the terrain, the local neighbors, the mythology of Alexander's lineage, because of course he's not just human, according to him. He's a demigod and then goes to full god. So whatever, you go with it. So just to kind of introduce the first slide as we're going through here. Okay, this is actually Alexander's father, Philip II. Okay, a marble bust of him, and minus the nose, it's slightly accurate, but he also, before he died, Philip II winds up losing an eye during a siege of one of the cities that he's fighting against. If it were not for the reforms that Philip does to the Macedonian army, it would have been very difficult for Alexander to have actually become the Great. Alexander's army, when he marches against Persia, is actually his father's. The vast majority of the officers that are in the Macedonian army are men that grew up and fought alongside Philip II. And we'll kind of get into that because as the Alexander's Persian campaign goes along, there's a split, a generational split between Alexander and his closest companions and Philip's officers, because they're looking at it as, okay, this is what we set out to do. we want to go home now. And we don't want to assimilate Persians as we go through.
And Alexander wants to go to China.
Yes. So also on this, this is a representation of one of the, types of military units that is going to be key for Alexander's conquests and is an adaptation of Greek, infantry from, hundreds of years before. So it's called the phalanx. Okay, these are men who basically form kind of this shield wall, and then they have spears that they use to project, okay, over their shoulders or underneath the spears. And usually they're lined up in ranks, and these ranks can go from, anywhere from, 8 to 12. Okay, Alexander or Philip is going to adapt that where he gives his soldiers longer spears, and he adds depth to these phalanxes so that they basically can. An enemy Greek phalanx cannot even get near the Macedonian phalanx because they can't get through the spears that are projecting in front of them. Okay, and so that's going to give them a huge advantage as they go through. So let's kind of talk about, okay, who is Alexander? Who is his family? Okay. The Macedonian royal family that he's part of is predates him by 400 years. They're called the Argead dynasty. Roughly, their foundation of taking control of Macedonia is roughly about 700 BCE, and then lasts until 310 BCE. And again, the Macedonians, the nobility, and even the people, but especially the nobility, they try to project an idea that they are part of the Greek world, that they are from some of these city-states, the major Greek city-states that operate further to the south. Okay, and so for the royal family, they claim that they are from a man named Temenus, who's a great great grandson of Hercules, the demigod. He's son of Zeus and a mortal woman. So it's kind of an instance where, not only are they claiming descent from the Greek city-states, they're also claiming descent from the Greek gods. Okay, because in the Greek world, for the most part, they're all sharing the same language, same culture, same religion and mythology. And what we would consider Greece and what classical Greeks would consider Greek is basically, okay, the area that is in the yellow and the purple on the map. Okay, so these would be, the major cities like Athens and Sparta and Corinth. For the Greek city-states, they develop as independent political entities. Okay, each one of these city-states is basically its own state. It's not just the city itself, it's all of the surrounding villages and land where, they go through the process of mining or, growing agricultural products. They share, again, same culture, same language, same customs, and they won't cooperate if there's a larger outside threat. But a lot of times the Greek city-states are in competition with each other. And so you really, throughout a lot of what we consider classical Greece, there is no singular ruler of the Greek peninsula. Okay, they are all operating as different entities that will come together as they go through. The further north you go, okay, these are also, kind of Greek cousins who are going to be thrown in there. So Thessaly sits between Greece and Macedon in the north. Okay, and then if you go really kind of further to the northeast, you have the Thracians, who are even kind of viewed as more barbaric than the Macedonians are, but they make useful mercenaries. Okay, in the classic world. And then if you go further, okay, you're going more towards the coast of the Adriatic. You have the city of Epirus, which expands beyond just its city borders and actually ends up founding a kingdom. And Epirus and Macedonia, they are going to intermarry royal families a lot, for better or worse. And then, sorry, that sounds really ominous, but it is kind of ominous as we go. The further north you go into, okay, the Balkans, you run into groups of people that are called the Illyrians, and these are just barbarians as far as the Greeks are concerned. Illyrians will launch raids through Macedonia in order to try to get to these Greek city-states. Macedonia kind of forms this almost border region for the Greek world. They're cousins, they're semi-barbaric, but they serve as a nice buffer against other barbarians. And how many of you know where the word barbarian comes from, or the kind of the etymology for it? Okay?
A Greek word that means babbling, more or
Mhm.
less.
Because anybody who doesn't speak Greek sounds like they're saying bar, bar, bar.
Yep.
Okay? And again, it doesn't matter, how old the other, culture is, because the Greek, classical Greeks have contact with Persia, they've got, contact with Egypt. Much older civilizations, and the Greeks borrow heavily from them, but they still view them as kind of backwards as we go through.
As the Romans will do.
Yes. And so one of the reasons why, the royal family of the Macedonians it takes the name Argead is they're saying that they're coming from the city-state of Argos, which would be right here. Okay, it's a coastal city. It's in the Peloponnese. And according to Macedonian mythology, they're expelled from that city. This royal family is expelled from the city, and then they go further north, and then they settle in Macedonia, and they end up going through the process of starting their own kingdom. And Macedonia is different because, unlike the Greek city-states, Macedonia actually is a kingdom. So that royal family does rule that entire region, and they continue to expand over the centuries. There's an aristocracy that's with them, so offshoots of the royal family or other how they start out, other powerful warlords. Okay, people that the Argonauts need in order to ensure that they could, protect the territory that they're in. And even in this, mythology of how, Armenia starts, there's different versions of it. Okay, because again, over the course of centuries, the story is updated or there's new additions to it. A lot of this is coming through, especially, the 700s, the early foundation of this dynasty. There's not a lot of, actually written records in this region of this time. So a lot of the information would have been passed on by oral tradition. Okay, you'd have singers who would go through the process of, uh, oral poetry in the process of, keeping people interested in the royal court. So according to Herodotus, okay, the father of history, okay, in the histories, you have, okay, these three brothers, four technically, but only three we count, okay, who are in Argos. And what ends up happening is that there is a coup. Okay, so here's Argos actually pointed out on the map. The Argeads are from a group of Greeks that are called the Dorians. And the Dorians come in at the collapse of the Bronze Age in 1200 BCE. So they're, again, with the Dorians, it's kind of this instance where they are, they claim Greek descent, and actually they're going to be the ones who take over most of Greece after 1200 BCE. But the Dorians invade, okay, and take over most of Greece. You have a group, though, okay, that are going to be in this peninsula called the Peloponnese. Now, Argos is under the control, okay, of the Argeads, but there's a coup. Okay, their father is overthrown, and rather than being executed or with him, they decide to go into exile with their followers. And so they have this, long story of how they have this exodus where they're basically being forced out of Greece itself. They wind up going to the Oracle at Delphi, which is basically it's a religious temple that you would go in order to get prophecies read to you, to kind of tell you what the future is going to be, but they're really open to interpretation. They're pretty vague. Well, when they get to Delphi, they're told to just keep going further north. Okay, and eventually what will end up happening is they will find the location for a new city to start, and that's going to be Agag, again, around the idea of Argid. It's basically like a new Argos. It is not that far off the coast. It's actually located along one of the rivers, major rivers that empties out, okay, into the Aegean Sea. So it will serve as a good base for a new ruling class to come in. Macedonia, the terrain is a lot where this city is going to be founded is a lot more open, okay, and less mountainous and hilly than what you find in mainland Greece. So there's the ability for the city to actually grow bigger. There is the ability to, because there are planes for horses to be incorporated in the Macedonian military. So you actually have cavalry, which is very different from in the Greek peninsula because it's so mountainous. You just don't have enough pasture room for horses to be important. And so for, the Greek city states, infantry is the core of their army. With the Macedonians, they actually have mixed army force. They have infantry and they have cavalry. The infantry they use to pin an enemy in place, and then they use the cavalry to hit the enemy either in the flank or from behind. So the Macedonians are, and the Macedonians are also later on, they're very ingenious when it comes to siege warfare. Okay, they will actually have like torsion catapults and bolt throwers, which is something the Greeks started to develop but didn't incorporate very much in. And so, according to this, there's the idea that there is this, there's the coup in Argos. They're forced to flee and they go further north. And the son who ends up taking over, okay, and becoming the first of this dynasty is Temenus. And then the other brothers are supposed to be his generals and his advisors. In Macedonia, succession to king is not very clearly laid out. And we'll get to that a little bit later on. Okay, because you think of, if we think of like modern royal families, it usually passes from father to son. In the ancient world, that's not necessarily always the case. In many cultures, it's actually passing from, brother to brother. Okay, and until the line of, the sons of the original king die out, it doesn't go to the grandsons until afterwards. And that can lead to a lot of tension, shall we say, a lot of civil wars. Now, the next historian who's coming in after Herodotus is Thucydides, who ends up writing the history of the Peloponnesian War. The Argives were originally Temenids from Argos who descended from the lower highlands of Macedonia. So basically saying that, yes, they lived in the region of Argos before their expulsion, but the family originally was always Macedonian and just went back to reclaim its territory. And in this case, they're talking about this Argonid, Odyssey, I guess you could say, the march into Macedonia is basically a reconquest. Because one of the things the Argives and their followers end up doing, according to Thucydides, is they expel the population that is there. Okay, they end up pushing them into the mountains and basically, taking over the region and turning it, for all intents and purposes, kind of into a military city. Okay, and the people that they're going after, the largest concentration are these, and I'm gonna slaughter the name, Pyrrhia. Okay, and basically, this is why the Macedonians are going to be able to found their city where they do, because they get rid of this entire group of people rather than assimilating them. They either annihilate them or they push them out. And then, they will go through the process of founding, okay, their capital city, Aegea about here. Okay, and then from that original city, they go through the process of colonizing, okay, and incorporating other people that were in there. And one of the things that's really, again, like fascinating from a modern standpoint is just how much the Macedonians wanted to be accepted in the Greek world. Okay, the idea that they're, you know, when the original home city, capital city of the Gia is abandoned, Pella, the new capital city for the Kingdom of Macedon, is founded to its southeast, again along the same river. And the way that city is laid out is very, you know, particular. It's laid out in a grid work, very ordered, almost like a military camp. The palace is outside the city center. You have the agora, which is the area where you would have, you know, all of your business take place, literal economic business and also political business. You have shops around that, you'd have houses, you'd have public bathhouses, the temples like you would see to the different gods and goddesses in other Greek city states. The Macedonians go through the process of building Pella to look like the ideal Greek city. Because again, they want to be accepted in that world. And the Macedonians are very particular too, as this dynasty continues to grow in power and importance. They will hire Greek scholars to leave the Greek city states and go north in order to raise and teach the aristocracy and, you know, sons of the king in Greek culture. The idea is that they do want to be incorporated into this.
Alexander's a huge example of that because his father brings in Aristotle.
Yes. And it's not just Alexander himself who's taught
Right.
by Aristotle. It's all of the sons who are members of the Macedonian court and military. It's the idea that they are training together, you know, training their minds together, but also learning philosophy, learning tactics, and then understanding how they will fit into the Macedonian government and military machine together. And that's Alexander's actually going to, from his group of companions, he literally makes what he calls the companions. These are elite cavalry that go with him who serve as his generals and his bodyguards. And once he gets rid of his father's generals, a lot of the companions become the generals of the Macedonian army because Alexander knows he can trust them. Now, you know, again, to kind of lay out where all of these different regions are. Okay, you got Macedonia here, which is just kind of, again, sitting, okay, along, okay, the northern part, okay, of the Greek world. Thessaly is another territory that, you know, is not quite as mountainous as further down into the Greek peninsula. Thessaly has a lot of areas for pasture. Okay, has a lot of areas for horses. Men from Thessaly are used again as cavalry. You have Epirus. Epirus itself is located along the Adriatic Sea, but they end up taking over a big chunk of the southwest of the Balkans. You have the Illyrians, okay, to the northwest. The Paeonians to the north of Macedon. You have Thrace. You have Greek city-states too that have been set up as colonies all along, okay, the coastlines and even into the Black Sea. Okay, the Greeks went through this process of mass colonization. The cities would hit a certain point where there are too many people in the cities, and so what ends up happening is they send out expeditions, basically to go to different regions in order to found Greek city-states so that they could exploit the resources that were there. That doesn't mean that those Greek city-states are like beholden to their mother city. They are their own independent territories until something catastrophic shows up, and then they beg the powerful cities to come help them. And when I talk about that, it's along this coastline here. Because right next door is the Persian Empire. It is slowly moving in and invading and occupying the cities along this coastline. So what will end up happening is, okay, the Argias in Macedonia from 700 into 400 BCE, they served really as the northern buffer, okay, for the Greeks against everyone else who is in this region of the Balkans. They have to come through Macedonian territory in order to get to mainland Greece. So the Greeks go through this process of not allowing the Macedonians to really be part of the Greek world, except as a shield. Okay, you know the Olympian Games. Okay, where the Greek city-states, they get their athletes together, they hold these festivals, they hold these tournaments. And it's not just, a political ceremony, it's a religious ceremony as well. They don't allow the Macedonians to participate in those because they're too barbaric. And that is an issue with the Macedonian royal line. Because they're looking at it as if we're the ones who are holding everybody back, then we should be involved in this.
And there are times, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, just a question,
Mhm.
so much involves the Greek language.
Mhm.
And so much involves the Greek relationships between one city and another city.
Mhm.
And these other areas are kind of the country. I mean, I've always thought the
Yeah.
conflict was city versus country. Is that?
That's a little bit to it because for a lot of the city states that are down here, okay, in mainland Greece, you look at Athens, it's a democracy. It's not really a democracy, it's an oligarchy, but they're looking at, for the Greeks who are, in the main and what they consider the mainland, they're looking at it as it's a mixture of republics, oligarchies, there's some monarchies, but for the most part, they are independent. They're fiercely independent. They don't, they believe that they are at the height of civilization, the way that they operate. They might be in conflict with each other, but they're better than everybody else around them. When they're looking at Thessaly and Epirus and Macedonia, these are kind of like, again, proto-barbaric Greeks. They're still stuck in this idea that there's a royal dynastic family that is there forever, until they get overthrown. The people are, again, in kind of the Greek mindset, the Macedonians and the Epirites, they're crushed under this old version of government. In reality, most of the people in Macedon and Epirus never see the royal family, never really know beyond what's going on in their home village. Where, Athens, Corinth, Sparta, they expect everybody to be involved in the governing of those cities. They expect, if you have property, they expect you to be a soldier. They expect you to hold political office and not for your own power. You're doing these things for the betterment of the city state. Okay, and when they're looking at like Macedonia, these are the almost backwoods,
Yeah.
Smoky Mountain hillbillies, as terrible as that sounds.
You
There's
just said backwoods.
yeah, it was backwoods. That's true. Okay, sorry, that was very northern of me to
That's
throw
all
in
right.
there, but
Because we're teaching Civil War,
Yeah,
that's it.
who's Pella again and how big?
okay, Pella is going to be about right here. And you're looking at, look, city populations, I would say it's probably no more than 10 or 11,000 at its height.
Yeah.
Because there's, they don't have to be so compact as other city states. They actually can spread out into different areas.
Unlike Athens, Athens is very compact. I think there's 25 or 30,000
Yeah.
in it. And your comment about city versus country is one of the, what's the word I'm looking for? It's one of the ways that is presented as a way to interpret history in general, not just with the Greeks, but across all of human history. And how much that plays in and who has the land, and are the people in the city resentful of the land? Are the people in the country resentful of what is supposedly the culture in the city and all of that? So that's you're dead
you're
on
right
with
on.
that.
I always thought it was ironic because you live in a city, you have less freedom than if you live in the country.
Mhm.
And yet,
They look down on the
cradle of democracy is in a big city.
That's relative though, right? I mean, think of it like around here, right? Okay, you have more physical freedom. You can get in your car and drive to places and go and do things, and there's open spaces, right? But like, we don't have the freedom to easily walk to a grocery store, right? So it's different types of it, yeah. In the modern day. Oh, it's a little different, but,
Well, let's take okay, I'll answer that question. We'll take a quick little break.
well, no, remember we started at 9:30.
Oh, that's correct. We had 9:30.
Yeah,
I'm sorry.
I know.
I'm used to having it start an even hour. 9:30 just totally threw me off this morning. Quick,
Take a
go
break
for
right
it.
now.
Well, just a comment, when I
Please.
was in college, I got to know a young woman from the Detroit area. And she was fiercely proud of being Macedonian.
Mhm.
They were not
Yeah,
Greek, you know, and it's just a complete reversal of what you're talking
Yeah.
about now.
Well, there's
In
Yeah.
ancient history.
a lot of
and that's,
stuff that happened in between.
yeah, I was saying, and that-
Yeah,
yeah, and
that
that's,
is.
and that's the part of Macedonia really rises as a power when the Greek city-states collapse. You know, and they fill in that vacuum, and then the Macedonians are looking at it as we are the leaders of this Greek world. And there are cities in, yeah, there are cities in mainland Greece that do not care for the Macedonians, even after the Macedonians come to ascendancy.
Well, and we'll talk about that.
Yeah.
Athens in particular had a
And
few.
Sparta.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Another thing, talking about how the Greeks felt about the Macedonians, right? In the Persian Wars, okay, if you look at the map, all right, you have to, you know, Persia can either go around on land or they can go across on the sea. Persians aren't terribly inclined to go across on the sea, so they go around on the land. Well, it's in, I think it's in Herodotus. There's a story about the Macedonian general, and he sees the Persians coming, and he basically walks out to the border and surrenders immediately, and then offers the Persian general one of his daughters. They don't even try to protect them. So the Greek city-states, you know, further south hold some resentment for that.
Yeah.
Okay, so
Well, yeah.
there's other
And I,
political
yeah, I was
things.
gonna say,
that
and and that's a huge part to it too. And I actually have a little thing about that with the Macedonian.
I got ahead of you.
So, no, you're fine. But one of the city states that the Macedonians have the most interaction with, and at times they're allies, at other times they're hostile towards each other. It's going to be the city state of Thebes. Okay, and Thebes comes up, that you don't hear too much about Thebes in Greece. If you think of the city of Thebes in the ancient world, what sounds more familiar?
With Crete.
Well, there's Crete, but a little bit further south, Egypt.
Oh.
Yes, the Egyptian city of Thebes had a different Egyptian name, which the Greeks did not want to have to go through and try to translate. And so they renamed it Thebes. And so the ancient, again, the ancient Egyptian city of Thebes, the Greeks, especially Herodotus, he does kind of this tour of the ancient world, the real ancient world, all the areas that predated Greece. And one of the areas he goes into extensively is Egypt, going along the Nile. And when he goes to the Egyptian capital city, he's like, this is too many letters. And so shortens it down to Thebes. A lot of the things that we, have from Egypt, what we call ancient Egypt, are actually Greek terms for that. The pyramids, the Sphinx, all of that is Greeks trying to bring that into their world. Now, Thebes is, again, it's one of the strongest of the city-states in northern Greece. It is a rival many times of Athens and Corinth and Sparta. One of the things about Thebes is they're another city-state that really knows how to survive. As in, they have no problem breaking alliances with even fellow Greeks if it's going to keep them alive or give them some sort of advantage. The Athenians hate them, the Spartans hate them, and the Macedonians hate them. But they're kind of literally, they're kind of literally in the gateway, okay, of how to get into Boeotia, which is this part of Greece. You have to go through their territory. And a lot of times, if there's like major invasions by Illyrians or Thracians, Thebes will send messengers to Macedonia saying, hey, start raising your armies, and then the Theban army will march out, and then we'll catch, okay, the barbarians as they're coming through mountain passes and annihilate them, and then kindly go back home.
Yeah.
We don't want you here anymore. But Thebes is actually, for all of its perfidy, we shall say, they actually are very effective at war, because eventually they are the ones who figure out how to beat the Spartans. And what's really kind of crazy about it is that the battles that they fight against Sparta to crush them is roughly around the time that Philip II, Alexander's father, is a hostage in Thebes. And so what he does is he interviews the military and political leaders in Thebes to learn how they did it. And then he uses that experience to beat them. Okay, so you go through it. Usually what ends up happening in order to keep this alliance functional, keep the Macedonians in check, and ensure that they actually honor, the agreement with the Thebans, even though they don't always do the same thing. Members of the Argid family, the sons, usually are sent to Thebes as hostages. Okay, and it's not, don't think of hostage like they're under house arrest or they're in a prison. They're in the city basically to ensure that their fathers do not turn on their allies, but they're educated in Greek arts, okay, rhetoric, philosophy, history, mathematics. They are schooled in the same way, and there's a practical reason for that. The idea of hostage taking, what you're really, and this continued, through, the Renaissance, in different areas, not just here, but the idea behind that was you take the sons out of their royal court, you take them out of their comfort sphere when they're young. And then what happens is you educate them in the dominant culture. And what happens is you're basically, as gross as it sounds, you're grooming them to understand that they are a servant of the dominant power. Okay, they will understand that they have to work with, the ruler of whoever their, is their sovereign and won't rebel. And they understand that they not necessarily, the hostage doesn't really understand this. But the society they go back into sees them as this is kind of who we have to follow, but they're also not really part of us anymore. Because they're more loyal to the people who raised them than to where they originally came from.
Sometimes it bites people,
Yes,
because the Romans did that a few times, and that's how they ended up losing at the Teutoburg Forest,
Yeah.
which is a little later, but.
Yeah. And another example of that, much later on, is Vlad Tepes. Okay, with the Ottomans, he and his brother Radu were sent by his father, who's the ruler of Wallachia, to go to Constantinople to be hostages. Radu went with the Ottomans. Vlad went with the Wallachians. He used the Ottoman army to get him into a position of power after his father and older brother were murdered. And then as soon as he came into power, he wiped out the Ottomans that were there. And then, held it in check. So, and in this case, with the Thebans taking Philip and using him as a hostage, that came back to bite them.
Yep.
Very, very badly. Okay. Another ally that the Macedonians have, and they're an ally, and they're also a rival in this area, is that kingdom of Epirus, okay? This chunk of territory right in here. Again, they're on the very northern fringe of the Greek world. And again, the Greeks think of the Epirites as kind of primitive Greeks, not quite in the same vein as everybody else. But in order to keep, the Epirites and the Macedonians from killing each other, a lot of times the royal families intermarry. Again, the idea is, trying to get this dynastic alliance. The two kingdoms will not join, but the idea is that they will be good neighbors to each other. And you have an Epirite princess, Olympias, who's going to be married to Alexander's father.
That's
Philip
Alexander's
II.
mother.
Yeah, it's Alexander's mother. And with the Argids, this is not, a single monogamous relationship. A king will have multiple wives at the same time. And that leads to issues too, because depending on, what they produce, what they produce, so to speak, son or daughter, that knocks that wife down a peg. And that's one of the reasons why Alexander and his mother are so nervous. Later on, Philip marries a new wife who potentially could produce a new son who would knock Alexander out of line of succession.
Olympias was lucky enough to have produced Philip's first healthy son.
Yes.
Alexander does have an older brother, but he's not well.
Yeah.
And he's
uh,
probably, we would describe maybe as I don't know if he was Down syndrome or something
Yeah.
akin to that, but he was born with a mental disability.
Yeah.
Um,
and he was,
so So he would have been, but
Yeah, but he was knocked out of contention, and even with
Yeah.
Philip II, we'll get to the story. He's not the original heir to the throne of Macedonia. He's the brother of the original one. But probably, again, when it comes to monarchs and emperors, probably the most famous one in the ancient world is King Pyrrhus. Okay, from 319 to 272 BCE. He claims that he's, a direct blood relative of Alexander the Great.
Well, he is.
He should be, well, he is,
He's
but
second cousin or something
yeah,
like that.
and he believes that he should be, again, since Macedonia was the dominant power in the Greek world for a while, he believes that since he is a blood relative of Alexander, he should be ruler of the Greek world. So he's going to turn on his fellow Greeks, and then he's going to fight against the Romans. And for a little while, he manages to briefly conquer fairly decent, and I say briefly, he makes incursions into Macedonia and Greece and Syracuse and southern Italy. Okay, and then, but there's something really famous about him, and that's his version of victory. Have you ever heard the term Pyrrhic victory? Okay, Pyrrhus used the same type of, infantry and cavalry and war elephants that Alexander did, just not to the same brilliance on the battlefield. Pyrrhus wins battles against the Romans in southern Italy, but each battle costs him nearly half his army. And his general is like, well done on your victory, sir. If we continue to be victorious in one more battle, we'll be ruined. Because his army each time is halved. And then he has to take a couple seasons, a couple years to rebuild it so he can go back on campaign. And then to make things even less glamorous for him, he's forced to abandon his campaign in southern Italy because the Greek city-states who asked for his help originally, he wants to be a tyrant in this region, so we'd rather have the Romans, thank you. They kick him out of southern Italy, and then he goes to campaign in Greece, and then he's killed in a siege when, according to the story, a woman throws a ceramic roof tile off and crushes his skull. Not exactly as glorious as, not a great way to go. But again, this is a bust of him, during his time with southern Italy, so it's like, you win some, you lose some. He didn't win very many. And like what Chrissy was saying,
Yes.
okay, the biggest rival to the Greek world, and pretty much anywhere in the ancient world for a period, is the Persian Empire. Okay, the Achaemenid Persian Empire. This is founded in 650 BCE. Well, it really starts to expand in 650 BCE. It originally starts out in this territory called Persis, and that's where Persia comes from, the title for it. This is another instance where this is a tribal people, okay, in the southern part of an area that is related to a larger group of people that are called the Medes. The Persian and Median royal families intermarry. And then eventually what ends up happening is the Persian, product of that marriage, the grandson of that marriage, ends up conquering, okay, Media, and then continues expanding in every direction. And by the time we get to the 400s BCE, they have conquered what today is all of the modern Middle East, Egypt, okay, and part of Libya, and pretty much all of Central Asia, all the way up to India and Afghanistan. Okay, the Persians have a gigantic empire. And one of the things that makes them so successful is that the Persian king, basically, what happens is that he uses the existing administration, the existing political structure that is in these regions, and leaves it there after conquest. If the locals, so to speak, if they're willing to submit, they keep most of their power. You've heard, the term King of Kings. That is something that applies to the Persian king. Okay, he is the top most important one inside the Persian Empire. The lesser kings of the territory that he takes are still royalty. They're just subservient to him, okay, as they go through. Now, where Persia and Greece come into conflict is after the Persian conquest of this territory called Lydia, you have this, massive series of Greek city-states that are along, okay, the Aegean coastline, and then along the coastline of the southern Black Sea. The Persians conquered them, okay, and they expect them to basically just incorporate into the Persian Empire like everybody else they've captured. And these Greeks cannot handle that. Okay, these are what are called the Ionian Greeks. They will end up causing the war between Persia and mainland Greece because the Ionian Greeks revolt and they do not have the military power and they do not have the money to hold off, because again, they're clinging along the coast. They do not have the power to fight the entirety of the Middle East and Central Asia on their own. So what they do is they beg the original Greek city-states for aid. Send us soldiers, send us warships, or send us money so that we can hire mercenaries. Sparta, which is, one of the big city-states, okay, in the Peloponnese, is looking at it as, well, evacuate. Leave that area. It's Persian territory. If you don't want to be under the Persian Empire, get out of there. Problem solved. Athens is looking at it as, we're not leaving. The encroachment of the Persians is a threat to our overseas trade and our overseas colonization. So Athens sends military aid. No surprise, the Persians show up and they crush each of these Greek city-states that are rebelling, one after the other. And when they find out how much aid the Athenians and other Greek city-states gave them, the Persian king decides to raise an army and then march overland in order to subjugate the Greeks, okay, as punishment. And this is where Macedonia, the Macedonian army is sitting there and they're like, wow, that's a lot of guys and a lot of cavalry. And there's also a big naval contingent that has sailed from those Ionian Greek city-states across the Aegean to try to land and basically squeeze Greece into pinchers. Now, the army that marches, overland never engages the Greek city-states because that naval expedition does land on mainland Greece at a place called Marathon, which is a small village that's to the northeast of Athens. And they are sitting there, and the Persians are originally sitting there waiting. They've pulled their ships onto the shore. They have built a fortified camp because they're waiting for that bigger army to march south. But the Athenians and their allies do not give them time to do that. Okay, the Athenians will end up charging into the Persians, and the way they have it set up is that the Athenians are on either flank of this phalanx, and then their other allies are in the center. The Athenians sacrifice their allies so that they can come in and hit the Persians from the side and the flank. That causes the Persians to panic, and they actually abandon the camp, and they start to pull their ships back into the water because they believe it's safer. Well, it is a victory, but there's still a significant chunk of that Persian amphibious force still alive that could potentially, now that the Athenian army is out of the city, that navy might make an end run and try to land in Athens. So this is where the mythology of the marathon comes from. The reason why it's so long is because, one of the Greek phalanx members, a hoplite, runs from Marathon back to Athens to tell them that there's victory at Marathon, but that the Persians might still be coming. And if you know the story, he runs, he screams his message, and then he drops dead. Which is entirely possible. It's entirely possible as we go through there.
Pretty much the same happens today.
Yeah, it's like you start out strong, and then that last mile is like, oh my God, what did I do? But the Persians do end up putting a significant presence in that territory of Thrace. And even though this first Persian war is a Greek victory, for the Persians, they look at this as a speed bump. They're used, quite literally, they're used to fighting larger entities. And so for them to lose, the soldiers that they did and the ships they did, it's a drop in the bucket. Now, what ends up happening though, is that the king of Persia ends up dying before he can get his second campaign rolling, and it is his son Xerxes who is going to go through the process of starting the second Persian War. And in this case, it's even bigger. Okay, if you go with, the Greek historians are talking about how this Persian army is 1 million men strong, marching overland, which is impossible because there's not enough food for the people, water for the people, fodder for animals that we need to go through. There's not any modern roads that would actually be able to support that many. It's probably about 200 to 250,000. It's still huge compared to what the Greeks can throw in there, but it's not as, again, with the Romans and the Greeks, they always inflate the numbers because it makes it look more spectacular when there's the victory. The other thing that Xerxes does is he builds a huge navy to support it. And instead of having the army and navy march separate, while the army is marching overland, they're going along the coastline, and the fleet is following them so that they could support each other. Okay, they get into, this huge army comes into Macedonia, and the king there is like, you can pass through, and any food, anything you need, it's free of charge. Just keep going. So that's the second time that the Macedonians have burned the Greeks. The Persian fleet, part of it is destroyed in a storm, but the army itself gets through Macedonia, gets through Thessaly, and then gets into Boeotia. And the first battle that the Greeks fight them at is Thermopylae. Okay, so King Leonidas, his 300 Spartans, and 7,300 other Greeks, but we'll ignore them being there.
We won't mention those.
Nobody needs to know about them. They're holding this pass. Thermopylae is a pass, a mountain pass that is along the coastline. And you can only, in the ancient world, you can only move 2 carts side by side down this thing, so it's very narrow. Thermopylae also had defenses that had gone into ruin, and so this Spartan and other, Greek contingent had gone there to rebuild the walls and the citadel that was there to hold the Persians off until all of the other city-states can raise their armies. Lo and behold, their army is not big enough. The Greeks, they managed to hold out for a while. Leonidas and his 300 plus 1,700 others, again, don't need to know about those 1,700 others because some of them are Thebans. They stay. The rest of those Greeks retreat further south in order to join up with the armies that are being raised. Leonidas and his 300 and the others, save for the Thebans, are killed by the Persians. Persians keep advancing further south. The Spartans are telling the Athenians, we can't hold your part of Greece, evacuate everybody and come to the Peloponnese, come to this peninsula, and we'll fortify it so the Persians can't come through. The Athenians don't do that. They do evacuate Athens, but they go to the island of Salamis, which is to this basically kind of to the southwest of Athens, and they stay there, and they're able to defeat the Persian navy. I swear I'm getting to a point here. What ends up happening is the Greeks end up defeating, this second Persian invasion, but Athens is burned to the ground. A lot of these cities that have been allied to Athens have been sacked and damaged. Thebes, where I was talking about the Thebans, how they were being held prisoner by the Spartans. As soon as Thermopylae is lost to the Greeks, the Thebans sent envoys to the Persians basically to ally with them. So they betray their fellow Greeks, as they go through. Well, eventually the Persians are expelled. The loss at Salamis is combined the next year by the Spartans and all of the other Greeks defeating the Persian army that stayed behind, and then a Greek navy that lands on the coastline, where those Ionian Greek city-states are. They destroy the Persian fleet, and then they get those city-states to rebel again. And to make matters worse, Xerxes' family, Xerxes and his father Darius, technically were not the kings of Persia. Darius the father had performed a coup and annihilated the original Persian royal family with 12 conspiring families. Once he came into power, he then wiped out those 12 families. Okay, so Darius and Xerxes are on shaky ground. When the news of the defeats come into the Persian Empire, there are rebellions in Central Asia and in Egypt. Xerxes will sign a peace treaty with the Greeks in order to crush these Persian uprisings, because it's more important to have the homeland under his thumb than it is to fight these Greeks now. We could fight them again later on. You have something you want to say?
I've been looking for a quote, but which I can't find. The thing to remember as we're going forward with this is these Persian wars are the basis for Philip's and then Alexander's desire to go and conquer Persia later. It's all payback for the Persian wars. Okay. This is something that is worth remembering when you're looking at other European history and history of the Mediterranean, is that most of the European history that you read that comes from Europeans sees this as a turning point. Okay, the Persian Wars are the time when Europe was able to stand up against the East, okay, in inverted commas there. And it's because of that that Europe is able to do everything it does afterward. Okay, now that's an old-fashioned way of looking at it. Okay, but you see that kind of idea follow through. And what I was looking for was a quote from, there's a wonderful series of the history of the world by Will Durant. The first one was published in 1935, and it's being published by an American. So it has the American point of view in the 1930s. Okay. But he has this wonderful line about how, because of this, the Greeks were able to avoid the Eastern people taking over, and I was going to read the quote because it's so bad. It's something like the enervating and feminizing influence of the Persians or something like that. And I was going to read it because it was bad, not because it was, but it gives you the idea because that idea still holds for sure.
Well, I'll tell you what, now let's take
Now
a break.
Yeah.
We'll come back at 10:30. And we will continue.
Oh, it's
Oh,
25.
Oh, whoops, yeah. All right, come back at 10:35.
Yeah. Come back in a few minutes. That's it.
Oracle of Delphi is just a strange thing, you know,
Yep.
how did that come about?
Is in all honesty, it's a place where there is a sulfur and methane vent. And they figured out that if people hung out around it, they would so end up in an altered state and they start talking for the gods.
Whole thing with
So,
Persians.
and then you have some people who figure out that they can make money off of that. So there
Right.
you go.
I mean, really,
Like-
they could, when you say.
I mean, it had like
Like most
huge
business.
significance, you know, and I'm like, I think it was like someone kind of overcome by noxious fumes
Yeah.
or drugs, because they said it couldn't win.
Yeah, yeah.
I'm like,
Yeah. And
And they were lucky.
That's, well, you know,
That they were just too far.
go
And
figure on
that's-
religion.
that's part too. Egypt was always in the state.
Time wise, where
Against the
where are
Persians,
we
They had to leave
in the
the
Trojan?
Trojan Wars are around 50 BCE, so we're roughly 1,900 years
I
out.
mean, the whole empire.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
And of course, they had the roads, but still.
And a lot of the supplies would have to come,
Big.
would have to come by sea just to make it just that's faster than by
I
land.
know, I think,
Yeah,
I know people argue that, but.
Yeah.
I'm glad you.
yeah, and you know, Egypt's a problem, and then the further east you go is a problem for the Persians, because Bactria and Sogdia, you know, and even the Indus, that whole kind of eastern part, you know, the far eastern parts,
Yeah.
it's part of the Persian Empire, but it really never contributes much, you know, there's more trouble
Yeah.
there than anywhere else, because you've got, you know, that area, so many nomadic peoples moving in and out of that region, that if people of Bactria and Sogdia a lot of times they would align with the nomads because that was their culture, and then they would rebel.
Yes. Well, I see that as cities versus
Mhm.
the nomads.
Yeah, exactly.
So they had the same problem
Yeah,
that Greece had with the Macedonians.
yeah,
They were,
yeah.
they wanted
Constantly
to
had
be
to-
pinned down to cities.
Yeah.
Now, nowadays, we still are enamored of big cities.
Yeah.
And yet, and they are important, but.
Yeah.
You know, there's a limit to what you can do, but, and people do tend to get a little arrogant.
Well, and that,
In
yeah,
cities, like we're the city, I grew up in Chicago. And it was the city versus the country. Oh, they're in the Hicks. Those people are from, they call them the Hicks.
Yeah.
But I guess that's another word.
Yeah.
Country folks. Which is
and,
not sustainable in the modern world,
no,
to have that conflict. Anyway, but
Yeah.
it's just interesting, because thousands of years ago, that same,
but we're still, yeah.
you're still arguing those.
Yeah.
And it's still arguing east versus west.
Yeah.
Okay.
And like, through here. You have, this is mostly nomadic. There's a lot of pasture land, in some areas, there's a lot of desert. You have some cities, but they usually sit like on major trade routes like the Silk Road. Where there's oases and things. But, and then smaller villages. And this area is a huge problem for the Persians, and it's a huge problem for Alexander once he gets there. He spends more time there than he does, in this part of the Persian Empire, because he just has to keep going back and forth.
We in the western part of Persian Empire, the cities,
Yeah,
you conquer the city and then you've got it.
yeah.
There, when
Mhm.
you have a city or a small city.
Yeah.
And then you've got a bunch of angry people
Yeah.
that live in the mountains.
Yeah.
Yeah,
and-
it's like them.
Yeah, and here, a lot of it is cavalry, there's.
It's
a
not,
lot of
it's not, it's just not completely unlike your Civil War story with the West Virginia.
Yeah. There's
They-
nothing there.
We're not interested in being part of all this city stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's that's the huge part to it too, it's.
Yeah.
And again, further east, for the most part, the Persians were just, the Persian king was just like, as long as they're not in rebellion. Yeah, just leave them alone, and,
Yeah.
we'll just let them go. But, through all of here, I mean, that's where your big, population centers are at.
Interesting.
That's As, you go further north along the Black Sea, Caspian Sea, that's where you have Scythians, who are horse nomadic people. And then you go further here and you're starting to get kind of the early Hunnic and Turkish people who are also,
So
nomads.
the Persians never really handled the Scythians.
They would buy them out. They would give them like a year tribute, or they would hire some of them as mercenaries, and they too were different tribes where some would be friendly, some would be hostile, and you just kind of hoped, that you gave them enough gold and silver to buy them for the year.
Weren't some of those cities on the south end of the empire trading cities with India?
Yeah.
Okay, so they had,
Yeah, they had a pretty significant group of cities along the coast. It's just as you went further into the interior that you're running.
So
into.
that was more sort of,
In this,
and we would say city.
yeah, in this area too. Is, usually got a lot of the rains, the precipitation, so, and even though it's mountainous, it was still really green, you could grow, crops, you could have horses and everything. But when you get into these areas, the mountains that are along the coastline basically stop any rain or snow from coming into these, so like. Fredonia, I mean, this is like desert, and then further up here, it's really not so desert, so. There were actually big pockets of the Persian Empire that really didn't have, significant populations.
And that's the stands now,
Yep.
like Turkmenistan.
Yep, Afghanistan.
They got oil, but so it's.
Yeah, and that's, most of the things that they didn't really. And they were in the path of the trade going from India and China westward. So,
When you say significant populations, what is that?
I mean, like large cities.
I know, but what's the number? Like, what are you thinking?
It's
Security.
20,000-30,000 people per city. A lot of it is, in, the central part, a lot of it is smaller towns or cities. Yeah, because again, a lot of it, a lot of these areas, it depends on how much rain they get.
Right.
When you're looking at, this part of the Persian Empire, Babylonia, Assyria, Media, Susanna, okay, Persia, these areas get a lot of rain, or they have year-round rivers. And they end up developing, irrigation systems that could support these huge populations. Where the further east you go, this becomes more, not necessarily desert, but more, think of it more like kind of the Great Plains before settlers would have went in there. It's grassland, so it's pastoral nomads. It's people who are on horseback, who are herding sheep or goats, horses, and moving season by season to different areas. And that's a very really poignant thing about humans is your mode of subsistence. How do you get your food? And that goes back to the city versus the country. As soon as humans start working with agriculture, we domesticate animals and plants, you start to have that split. If there's a year-round river or plenty of water, that's usually where you get those ancient cities. The first cities start out along the Tigris and Euphrates, okay, the waterways, or along the coastlines, because there's fresh water. And if there's enough open ground for it to grow and put together, plants year by year, then your population goes from food gathering to food production. You basically change the environment. And you hit a point where eventually your fields are going to produce more than your people consume. And so you get a surplus, meaning you start having more children, then more workers for fields, and that population keeps growing. And so, this area of Babylonia, ancient Mesopotamia, this is where, one of the cradles of civilization starts. It's the heartland of cities, because there are thousands of cities over the course of, centuries that come through, but there's still nomads. Okay, there's still the pastoralists who are moving animals back and forth. They're not sedentary. And each of them, it's a symbiotic relationship, because each of them needs something that the other provides that someone can't get. Okay, so like the city dwellers, there's food, but you also have to think, luxury goods, wine, olive oil, different types of clothing, metalworking, things that are not available for those nomads. And so what do the nomads bring in? They bring in the animals and the animal products. Okay, or they're the ones who bring in long distance trade from somewhere else, because they serve as either the caravans or the caravan guards to make sure the stuff can come overland. Okay, and so, and there's still pastoral nomads almost everywhere in the world. I mean, the huge, one of the things that the the current Iranian government is kind of, looking into is that there are still pastoral nomads inside, the Islamic Republic of Iran who are living the same way that they did hundreds of years ago, where they're going from, in the spring and summers, they go into the mountains because the snow melts and you got grass growing there. Then as the winter starts to come in the fall, the cold weather fall and winter, they go into the valleys. There's still people who do that in Central Asia. Hell, in Mongolia, there's, their cities, most of their cities are mobile because they're moving with their herds as they go through. But when it comes to Greece, in this area, because, land, arable land where you can, actually have these fields is so kind of limited. It develops this idea of land ownership. Again, why the city-states fight against each other so fiercely is that they're fighting for limited resources. And here, it's not that, the resources are completely unlimited, but this is a huge chunk of terrain spread, across a quarter of the world as you go through. But to give you an idea, what ancient Macedonia is going to look like, it has, kind of the best of all terrain. When you go by the coasts, it has this really flat, arable coastline where you can have the cities that are going to be able to sit on the coastlines to get, fish, to be able to trade, with sea trade. You're going to have, kind of these big mountain valleys that are rolling through where you have the rivers that are going to kind of slowly empty out towards the ocean or towards the Mediterranean Sea. And you have the cities that are going to be there. A lot of times the rivers are the highways for these cultures. Again, it's not that, the wheel doesn't exist in these areas, but for a lot of the ancient cultures, the river is the fastest way to get from point A to point B. And you do have draft animals, you do have carts, but if it's some sort of good that's going to rot on the way, you want to put it on a boat because that's going to be a safer way to go through there. When you go into kind of northern Macedonia, and again, Macedonia in the ancient world is not necessarily the same as modern day Macedon. Okay, because what we would consider kind of, the southern part of ancient Macedonia is part of northern Greece, and then there's a Macedon to the north, and then so it's, the old kingdom, the ancient kingdom has been split compared, in the modern day compared to what it is. But these, mountains as you go through, you would have the valleys in between. This is where you have your farmland, your pastures, your cities and small villages. And then a lot of times, if you can make it happen, if the terrain is correct, you would try to put your major cities close to the mountains because that provides you with protection. Okay, the mountain is a natural fortress. You build the wall you build the city kind of on a flat part to it, and then you build the wall. So there's only a couple ways you can get up to it. And then you dominate everything that's around there. And with Macedonia, again, they are not operating as individual city-states. Pella is the capital, the Argias are the rulers, and there are other cities spread out in that area, but they know who is the ruler. Okay, they're not going to rebel against it. Again, with the Vardar, and again, I'm slaughtering these, and I'm sorry about that. Peliakman rivers, these are year round. So unless you have some really significant droughts, these are going to be the water source for the vast majority of the large cities. Okay, and so you have the cities basically springing up along those rivers because that's the highway. It makes it easier to go through. The other thing is too, with, Macedonia, they have a lot of natural resources that are going to help them. A lot of gold mines, a lot of silver mines. That's one of the things that helps Philip go through the process of reforming and enlarging the Macedonian army to make it a professional army. It's a standing army, meaning that these are not, people who volunteer in the city-state to fight for a season. These are men who are trained for war, who are ready to go to war at any point in time. That money helps supply their pay, their food, and their equipment, because they don't have to buy their own penalty. They don't have to buy their own armor. their own shield, their own sword, their own sarissa, their own spear. The state provides it for them, so everything is uniform. And same thing with royal stables. The Macedonians go through the process of, the royal family has thousands of horses that they breed in order to make sure that there are, the number of them for the army. Forests, okay, for the timber, in order for, shields, for the spears. Macedonia is not really that great at building ships, but they provide the wood for other Greek cities to build it as they go through. So, Macedonia is, yes, it is wild. It is for the Greek city states. It's a semi-barbaric state, but they have a lot of advantages in terms of what they can actually do. So here's the original city, the original capital city, okay, yeah, right here. And eventually it is, and again, the reasons why it's abandoned are not really given, at least not one that I can really track a solid reason why I could track down. The only thing that I can, I mean, some of the things I could think of why they would want to leave that area is that it is nearer to the wild borderland. Okay, and it's in an area that if the Illyrians did, try to push through there, this area is closer to that border. Eventually, you're going to get the city of Pella, that is going to be the capital city for Macedonia. There is royal burials, okay, the Argead dynasty from 700 up to 310. Basically, kind of have a region where they're going to bury their kings, kind of in the same spot, and it's midway point. Today it's like modern, the name of it is modern day Virginia. There is actually a museum that is set out there. And in the last, I want to say, sometime in the last 10 years, archaeologists were able to go into, the royal kind of burial site. They were able to identify Philip's tomb. Okay, still haven't identified Alexander's because Alexander's body never made it there.
It's in Alexandria.
Yeah, it's in Alexandria.
That's more than 10 years now.
Yeah.
I think that's more like
Yeah.
25.
And again, with Pella, this is going to be a brand new city that the Argeads are going to build, and they build it on a Greek model. They want it to look like the cities that are further south. So again, they're going through the process of looking at architecture in Thebes and in Athens and Corinth. They're looking for, in all purposes, the best to go through and spend their money on. Or again, it's the idea of trying to build prestige. They want to be accepted in the Greek world as they go through.
And then as you'll see when we show the little map of what it was supposed to look like, they took that to an extreme.
Yes. Yeah. And there are ancient ruins from there, and there's a modern city that has sprung up nearby. Just pretty much just like anywhere in Greece or Italy or Turkey, we have the ancient ruins, and then right next door, you have the modern town with hotels and buses that take you over to where you're at. And again, with Philip and Alexander, they want Pella to be the cultural, economic, and political hub of not just Macedonia. They want it as the hub of a united Macedonian Greek world. This is the product. Pella is basically a city that is not supposed to stop growing. This is a generational project. This is going to go from father to son to grandson and keep going, because again, the way Philip and Alexander are looking at, they use the Persian Wars as an excuse for why they want to be the leaders of the Greek world. It's not that they want the Greeks to be independent. They want the Greeks to contribute weapons and men to fight the Persians and be underneath Macedonian domination. Okay, so when Philip is making this call that all the Greeks should come behind the Macedonians, it's not altruistic. He's not doing it out of the kindness of his heart. He's saying, you're too weak to take care of this. And the best thing you could do is support the people who are strong enough to fight. So you have the city laid out as this grid. Okay, worth, how they want the temple set up, how they want the agora set up, how they want the shops to be set up, and then the houses. Again, it's almost a military camp. Yes, it is a city, but in the same sense, it is a very well organized city, and no matter where you are in it, you will be able to navigate where you need to go and where you need to be. Uh, Wide streets, again, to move people, to move merchandise, to move soldiers if you need to. Okay. Irrigation, moving water, drainage systems. Again, the idea is you don't want communicable diseases to break out. You don't want dysentery to go through or, typhoid coming in and wiping out a third of your population because it breaks out in one area. They're setting it up in order to, keep the population growing and protected. Okay, huge public buildings, so that agora, the agora is, well, if you wanna.
Okay, so
Go for it, explain
the
that.
Agora is the city center. It is the predecessor of the Roman Forum. Basically, it's a large square, next to be literally square. Where you're gonna have your political offices and places where people are gonna meet for political reasoning. On like one side of it, and then the rest of it, and then internal to it as well are gonna be your commercial interests. Okay, so. City Square.
Yeah, so it's pretty much, it's the heart of the city, and then palaces. Okay, again, with the argues, they don't actually want to live with the common people, so they build their palaces away from everyone else. You have, the temples to the different Greek gods and goddesses. You have theaters set up, so, again, drama, plays are a huge part of Greek culture, and it's a lot of times, when these plays are being put together, they're commentary on what is going on in the Greek world. And they're also, in some cases, kind of to a religious tone because they're writing, the stories of this. A lot of times it's, not just the humans as characters, it's the gods and goddesses too. And the really cool thing about, this extended Greek world is that you can have a play written, along the Ionian coast of Turkey, and it could be in Athens and Corinth at the same time. These things move place to place, which is amazing. And as new city states in the Greek world, are founded, a lot of the ones that are actually along that coastline of Turkey are larger and richer than the original cities in Greece. And they compete with each other in order to get scholars and writers and philosophers to come to their cities to show how great they are. Okay, and Pella is another example of that. And that's one of the things, that money that the Macedonian royal family has, they use it because they're bringing people in. They're like, okay, show us backwards people why, why Athens is so great as they go through. But this is, to a degree, kind of a reconstruction of what one segment of Pella would have been like. Here is the Agora in the center of the city. You have bathhouses, okay, commercial areas. So, think of it this way, like in ancient Greece and ancient Rome, they have food stalls. Okay, so that you can go, if you're going, you're going to the forum or the agora to conduct business and don't have time to eat at home. You can stop and eat there and you conduct business there. And then you go and you finish as you go through.
And you
Okay.
go to the baths and you finish some business there and then you go have lunch and you go, yeah.
Yeah.
When I was saying earlier that they took it to an extreme, what I was talking about was the regimented,
Yeah.
that's the ideal design. Of course, it never does work out that way.
Yeah.
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 Is there any similarity between Pella and Pompeii?
Only in that, I guess, both ancient cities, where he's talking about like the food stalls, that's where Pompeii is where we really came to understand what these food stalls look like for the
Yeah.
Romans. They weren't terribly different for the Greeks as far as we know. But in terms of like in literal sense, it was destroyed differently and it was, it wasn't, because Pompeii's got that.
Yeah.
That moment in time-ness to it.
And since
There are some things that are universal,
Yeah.
baths are gonna be
Again,
pretty
yeah.
universal in the ancient world.
the
school
agora, the
design,
forum, yeah.
Yeah,
And again, like with Pella, that is a design city, that is something that.
Which
it had-
Pompeii was
yeah,
not, yeah.
It had not been there, so it didn't grow up organically, it was built to a plan where other, Rome, Pompeii, Athens. They start out in one region and then they grow over time, and so you have these twisting small roads in different areas because. People aren't gonna let you tear down
Yeah.
their houses in order to put in something different.
They hadn't invented eminent domain yet.
Yeah, this is actually, okay, these kind of, okay, the street would be here. These are the ruins, the footprints, okay, basically the layout of these food stalls set up on the side of the agora. Okay, so, you'd have the roadway where people would have their traffic. You always had to have columns. In Roman Greece, because of they look
Shade.
cool, shade, and you have the space in between in order to go in. Basically to the sidewalk where these are located at. This is the bathhouse. Okay, so these are smaller baths. You would have had, the bigger pools that would be put in there, but there are smaller ones, to.
Different temperatures, actually
Different
clean
temperatures,
yourself,
yeah.
yeah.
You'd have, one area where, there's a pool that's cold, a pool that's hot. There's, primitive sauna, where you go in. Because again, with the bathhouses, it is a spot for people to meet and discuss business. Is weird, it sounds more privately than the agora, even though you have everybody and their brother there.
There's
How do
also
we
the
know?
gymnasium there too.
Versus cold, I mean, how do we know?
Usually what would happen is that for the hot areas, you have the layer where the baths are sitting, and then underneath there's a chamber where they would have the fires burning and the pipes underneath it in order to.
So,
We know it with certainty for Rome. We are pretty sure Greece did it too.
so how's the economics of that, okay? You have a food stall or
Mhm.
bathhouse. Are you an owner, or is the king on everything, or is there a little capitalism going on?
It depends.
Yeah.
The food stalls would usually be, that's something that's independently operated. It's whoever's gonna set up and sell, their whatever. The bathhouses sometimes held a fee and sometimes didn't. It depended on who was in charge of the city and whether or not they wanted to use that to their political advantage. Making the baths free was a way to get the poorer people on your side. So, yeah. So it just
And
depended on
there
where
is,
you were.
and there is coinage at this point in time.
Oh, for sure, yeah, yeah.
Because you'd have, silver coins, tin, bronze, copper, that you go through, and I'll show you some examples of those in a few.
Yeah, but there's a little proto-capitalism when
Yeah.
it comes to the food stalls, for sure.
Yeah.
And other
And then,
sale of goods.
one of the other things too is that, when they're building, this is the house of Dionysus. Okay, so this is a temple to the Greek god Dionysus, who's the god of wine and, partying. He's kind of one of the ones that, you had, but you kind of wanted to make sure that people weren't going to get too well with it because, enough people drunk, they might do some stupid stuff.
And did.
Yeah, and did. But they would have these beautiful mosaic tile floors in on the walls too. So again, it's the idea that you're bringing in artists and artisans to come in and beautify this. And it's not just in the public buildings. It's in people's homes too, if you have the money to do it. Okay. So this is kind of the foot plan of what's left of it. And then you see the modern village, behind it. So I mean, that would be, in one sense, it'd be kind of cool to live in that little village because you just go over there, whenever you needed a few minutes, except for the fact that you
Except
probably
for
have,
tourists.
yeah, hundreds of tourists. Kind of think of it like Frankenmuth, but the real deal. Okay. And then again, this is, these are the temples, in many cases, side by side. And a lot of times it's the footprint of the buildings that survive, the walls, the columns, the roof collapse, or more likely cannibalized for other projects. If the materials are not available, okay, you can't afford to do, that's one of the things that happens in ancient Egypt and ancient Rome. If they cannot get limestone or marble, they just take it from somewhere else. That's why the Colosseum looks kind of so terrible, is a lot of the case stones were taken off. Same thing with the pyramids. When you see the one pyramid where it's got the part of the top, the crust that has a different color stone, it would have looked like that all the way down. Except later builders basically went through and just took that material because it was on hand. And again, this is, there would have been more temples, okay, and the housing for the priests and priestesses around it, but eventually it gets knocked out. But you could see how wide, these roads are set up. But again, the idea is for the main thoroughfares, you want to have it as wide as possible so you can get as much traffic through as easily as possible. And here's where we get into the problem of being a member of this royal family if you're a male. To be, a son, a grandson, a nephew of the ruling, Archduke king is not always easy, and it is not easy being that king either. There are very few of these men in this royal family who die of old age and natural causes. A lot of the times they're killed in combat, or the other most prevalent way they go, assassination. Okay, killed by other family members or killed by people that they, spurned. Okay, military leaders, or in some cases, lovers. That's gonna end up happening quite a bit.
We'll talk about that next week.
Yeah, but again, the line of succession is not necessarily as easily laid out as it kind of is with the modern day. There's a reason for that. The royal families in Europe and other places, over the course of their development, have many times of assassinations and civil wars. And they want to make succession as easy as possible to avoid the kingdom being destroyed.
You can follow the line through European history of where they finally figured out what's called primogeniture, which is inheritance by the eldest son. Because there's these moments where you go, well, these people, to our mind, this person should have inherited, but instead of inheritance on that direct male line, it's inheritance by the family. So then, you got 4 sons that are going to try to kill each other over who owns France, that kind of thing. And eventually they figure out, well, if we just say it's this guy, and everybody goes along with it, because they try it a few times and the brothers don't go along with it. But at this point, there was not that, any attempt at that was not.
Yeah, again,
Appreciated.
it's still pretty tribal, because again, it's the
Yeah.
idea that it is this family and the male members of this family are the ones who are going to inherit. And there are times where you have a king being assassinated and the next in line is an infant, and then the other ones are supposed to be regents for them. Well, you can imagine that doesn't work very well, because the older, relatives are looking at us, why the hell should I be out of power for 14 years waiting for this kid to grow up and then probably turn on me? Which is something that is gonna end up happening. And so in this case, this is a Macedonian king getting knifed in the back as he's in the process of going through to a religious festival. That's something that happens a lot as they go through there. Again, a good example of, a society not having primogeniture rules, the Ottoman Empire. From the, 1290s into the mid 1300s. Whoever inherited was one of the sons or the brothers of the sitting sultan, and the reason they became sultan was they got to the capital first and were sworn in, and then either the other male relatives went along with it or they were executed. Okay, and so this is, again, this takes centuries for the idea of an actual agreed upon successor to go through. And sometimes you have an instant, not necessarily in this, sometimes you have it where primogeniture is established, but the father outlives his sons, and then the next in line would be a grandson, who might be an infant. Think Louis the 14th, Louis the 15th, Louis the 16th. They're coming in not as, the direct one as they go through. The other thing that, the kings have to worry about is keeping their generals and their officers happy. From, really the 4th century, the 300s BC. So, the time Philip is regent and then seizes the Macedonian throne, to Alexander coming into power and then Alexander dying without a direct heir. there are at least 5 major bouts of civil war in not only, the kingdom of Macedonia, but after Alexander has established his empire, all of Central Asia and the Middle East, because his generals say that they're the ones who are his successors, and they start fighting, and that's where we get this term diadochi. It's successors. It's Alexander's generals who basically decide individually that they are Alexander's rightful successor, his regent, because Alexander has a wife who is pregnant at the time he dies. And these generals are arguing amongst each other who is the one who is the regent to watch this kid.
Assuming it was a boy.
Yeah, assuming it was a boy.
There was this like 4-month wait of like,
And then,
do we even care?
yeah, and then by the time we get to the third round of Macedonian succession, 360 to 359, okay, after the the death of King Perdiccas III, who's supposed to be the one in Macedonia who's watching Alexander's mother, and you go through, it's not just Macedonians who are involved in this. It's Greeks, it's Thracians, it's the Thessalians, because they all want something out of it too. Okay, and this is going to be a Macedonian hoplite, so they're infantry. Okay, they're heavy foot soldiers as they go through. Okay, he has this small shield that basically there's a strap that goes around his neck, so he doesn't have to hold the shield with his arm. That's intentional because he needs both hands to be able to use the sarissa, which is a pike, a long spear that is anywhere between 12 and 18 feet long, depending on where he is in the phalanx, depending on where he is in that formation. You'll also notice, other than the fact that he's got socks, okay, he's a reenactor, we'll ignore that, we'll let that go.
Socks.
I know.
Socks and
He does not, the only thing that is technically metal armor is his helmet. Everything else that you're seeing here, that is linen, that is what's called laminated. It's basically pieces of cloth that are glued together in layers so that it's somewhat flexible so you can move with it and it's not heavy. Because again, the weight that he has to fight with is the sarissa, to move it up, down, kind of left or right as they go through.
and then have force behind it.
And
do
there's
something.
people who, if he's not the first one, or if he's the first one in line, he can have up to 10, 15, 20 people behind him pushing him. Because that's what a phalanx is. It is a group of people who are basically projecting those spears out in front of them, and the people behind them are providing force to try to break the other phalanx that's there. In this case, it's somebody who has some money, because his helmet has, either bronze or iron beard mustache put in there for decoration. It can also protect you from spear thrust or sword thrust to your cheek and your mouth. Problem is that, even with this, you're very hot because you're having a hard time getting breath in. Also, the bad part with this type of helmet and this type of setup is you can't hear things very well. So a lot of times when they go into combat, the reason why they use horns is that's the only thing they can hear. You can't hear somebody talking to you over the sound of, just people walking or screaming or metal, weapons hammering into each other. This Macedonian phalanx, this is what Philip reorganizes and makes into the best fighting machine in the ancient world.
The shield is not metal?
No, it's wooden. Sometimes there would be a metal boss, there'd be a metal circular part hammered into the center of it. But for the most part, this is a hardwood shield. And then this is kind of a leather covering that's then painted. Again, if it, there are examples of solid metal shields, but those are more along the lines of ceremonial. They're for if you put them in temples. You wouldn't, it's too heavy otherwise. That's one of the things that limits the Greek hoplites, is that their spears have to be shorter. At max, they're 6 feet long because their left arm is basically forced to hold their hoplon, their shield, so that it overlaps with the person next to them. Because this is strapped around his neck, he has both hands free. Plus, they usually have a short kind of curved sword because the sarissas break. If you have to use a sword, your phalanx is kind of failed because the enemy shouldn't have gotten that close to you.
Or you're in that last thrust
Yeah.
after you've pushed them off the field, yeah.
So they're all pushing behind.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and more casualties occur in phalanx warfare when the other side breaks. Okay, because what will end up happening is, the side that wins is pushing and then trying to keep up with them. The side that breaks, they know as soon as they turn their back, they're vulnerable. So there are instances a lot of times where the enemy phalanx will go backwards in order to try to protect themselves, because the Macedonians also have cavalry. And again, the Macedonians use the phalanx to pin an enemy, and then the cavalry to come in behind. It's the pursuit that kills most hoplites, trying to get away.
I don't know if this is like the best analogy, because I'm not a football person, but there's that moment in American football where people are just like pushing at each other. That's a phalanx, and then it's whoever takes the field, and
And a lot of times too, these phalanx, when the Greek city-states are fighting against each other, a lot of times they're not looking to annihilate the other line. They just want to break the
Yeah.
opposing phalanx and chase them off. Because you would lose significant numbers of men if you try to wipe the other side out completely and leave yourself vulnerable to somebody else. Where with Alexander and Philip, they're looking for a decisive battle. They want a clear winner as they go through. And a lot of times, the phalanx battles, they last maybe 2 or 3 hours tops, because you wear yourself out very quickly. And a lot of times you don't have extra lines of these phalanxes. It's a one thing and done.
yeah, it's like 5 deep or so.
Mhm.
The book to read on this, and I put it on the list on the schedule, is Victor Davis Hanson's The Western Way of War. Okay, and let me asterisk that, because don't bother reading anything else Victor Davis Hanson has written, or listen to most anything else that he has to say. He used to go by VD Hanson, and that was appropriate. Because he's not a good person, but this one book, he talks about how this idea of Greek warfare and the idea of having two sides and a battle, and you decide where you're going to fight, and you send messages between, and it's going to start at 9 a.m. and we're going to push until somebody's off the field, and how that echoes through into, I think he wrote, it's from the early aughts, so I think he wrote it through the first Iraq War, and how that follows through, and it's very interesting, but ignore him otherwise.
So now to actually get into the family, okay, the immediate family of Alexander the Great. And I told you I was going to show you some points. Okay. Alexander's, grandfather is King Amyntas III, ruling from 420 to 370 BC, and so this is him up here. One of the things that you notice in this coin is that he has a lion's skull and mane as a helmet, because that is going back to the mythology that he is a descendant of Hercules, because what was one of Hercules' tasks?
Yeah.
Build a lion, and then what does he end up doing? He wears a lion's fur as basically, kind of armor to prove that he has killed it. Alexander is going to have, when he's king, he has a helmet that is made to look like a lion's head and mane when he goes through.
And what's interesting on that is that in later history, you see people like Mark Antony, who has the lion sigil, and that's usually a reference to Alexander and not Hercules after this, which is just kind of an interesting little tidbit.
Because the Romans kind of, how should I say this nicely, they plagiarize Greek mythology and religion. It's just like, we don't really like the name Zeus, it's stupid. Yeah, go with that. As they go through it. So here's Amyntas III. He comes to power after the assassination of 2 kings before him. So he already knows that it's, this is kind of dangerous ground. It's not outsiders that killed my predecessors. It's my own people. It's my own family. Yay. Think about, if they had Thanksgiving at that period, how fun that conversation would be. Yeah. And so he has 3 sons, Alexander II. This is the first son. Perdiccas III. And then you have Philip II as the last son. So you've got, Alexander II here. And one of the things that you kind of see is that, these coins are 2-sided. One side you have, the face of the monarch. And then on the other side, you usually have some sort of mythological symbol or some sort of, animal. In this case, it's a horse because Macedonians are kind of famous for having horses. You have, okay, Perdiccas the third right here. In this case, this is a lion. You can tell because it's got the mane. You have Philip the second, okay, and this is when Philip has taken over, okay, as king, and so and that's how you kind of solidify within the kingdom that you are the legitimate ruler, is you have control of the mint, you have control of the money, and so you're putting your face on the coinage. Okay, so in this case, you have, okay, Philip in here, and mind you, he has the good eye on that side, took his good side. Okay, he's got the the laurel, okay, in order to signify that he's king. He's got the beard. Okay, yeah, he's got kind of long curly hair, which is, again, kind of with Philip II and Alexander the Great, they have kind of wild long hair.
They're
you know.
barbaric.
Yeah, they're barbaric as they
They're
go through.
hippies.
Yeah. And then on the back of Philip's coin, okay, you have one of his companion horsemen, one of the royal cavalry that is going to be working with them. And you can see, it's a regular one thing. There's no saddles yet. There's no stirrups. You're sitting on the back of the horse basically with a blanket, and then you're holding onto the bit that's in the horse's mouth. And you're controlling it by basically squeezing your knees together in order to get it to follow what you want. And the Macedonian cavalry have a shorter sarissa. They have a shorter spear. And then they have a longer, straighter sword in order to slash down as they're running people down. Okay. Now for Amentius III, his problem is not necessarily that it is, you know, internal issues. He is constantly under threat from the Illyrians, the people to his northwest. They're constantly raiding his territory. They actually chase him and his family out of Pella. They chase them out of Macedonia itself. And they have to go as refugees to Thebes and beg them to assemble their army and their allies to help them get the Illyrians out. And so again, trying to go through the process of finding, some sort of representation of what the, Illyrians were going to look like. The Illyrians don't disappear with the collapse of Alexander's empire. The Illyrians are there in the Roman times, and they're a problem for the Romans. So I try to get a depiction, a representation as far back as I could as they go in there. But you kind of see, again, they have the large round shield, okay, in order to protect as much of the torso and neck as possible. A lot of times, if they had the means, because in this case, the Illyrians are supplying their own equipment. So a lot of times, weapons and armor passes from father to son. So he has an iron helmet. He has an iron pectoral, so basically kind of a iron plate that goes to protect his heart and his lungs. And then he has iron greaves. And he has a spear, very much like, okay, a Greek or Macedonian phalanx would have. But then you have the majority of them. We're basically just operating in their regular, cloth clothing. Maybe they have a square shield, they have something they've salvaged from a battlefield. A lot of times what they're working with are javelins, okay, so they could throw them. They would have a spear. Maybe they have an axe. You don't see a lot of people in the ancient world having swords, because swords are expensive to create. You don't see a lot of those. So he and his family are pushed out of the Macedonian capital in 393 BCE. So not that long after he comes to the throne. And they are chased out of their own territory. And you have this Macedonian royal court and their followers flee to Thebes. And they're going through Thessaly, so they're asking them for help. And the people in Thessaly are like, well, if you can get somebody from further south to also join this army, maybe we'll help you get rid of the Illyrians, but we're not doing it ourselves. We're not helping you on our own. And so what will end up happening is Amentius has to go through the process of basically sending his youngest son, Philip, as hostage to Thebes to ensure this alliance. And, it's not a humiliation for Mencius to do this. He kind of expected he was going to have to. And again, it's the idea that, Thebes at that time is the dominant city-state in classical Greece. So to have them as an ally boosts Macedonian power. And again, it also, boosts the ability of Philip later on to understand better how the Greeks operate and maybe convince them that the Macedonians are not so barbaric. Okay. Now, what will end up happening in 370 BCE, okay, is Amyntas ends up dying. In this case, it's not through assassination. He ends up just dying of poor health from being on campaign so long. He does expand the list of allies that Macedonia can call on, but at the same time, he insults other Greek city-states because he goes towards Thebes. So there are people, Thebes in the north is like, all right, well, we kind of got the Macedonians under our thumb, but the Spartans and Athenians are pissed because the Macedonians didn't ask them. So you go through. Well, Amyntas dies. This time it's going to pass from father to son. The problem is that Alexander II is young. He hasn't hit what's called the age of majority, okay, where he's considered an adult at this point. So he needs someone to, basically kind of oversee what is going to happen. And a lot of times that's going to be older male relatives, along with the Macedonian generals. The idea is to kind of balance each other out. One side will not try to perform a coup as they go through. When Alexander meets his majority, so think majority like, 15 maybe, trying to go through the process of holding your kingdom together when you have hostile enemies to your north, your west, your northeast, your south as you're going through. This kid, yeah, and puberty. This kid's got issues, as it goes through, because what ends up happening is as soon as he comes to power, the Illyrians attack again. Because this is the perfect time for them to do that, because they're looking at it as this is a child on the throne for the most part. He has no battlefield experience. He has no diplomatic experience. He is coming in the shadow of his father. And so the Illyrians try to punch through and try to take the Macedonian capital again. The other thing that ends up happening is not only is he dealing with outsiders, there's someone else in the country, a man named Pausanias, who says that he should be the real Macedonian king, that he is a relative of the dead king. And so he has to fight a civil war at the same time that he is fighting outsiders. Okay, Philip is sent to Thebes, around this time. And he's, again, it's not house arrest. He is going, while his brother is struggling. Philip's kind of having the time of his life to a degree, because he's able to go into Thebes and again experience everything that city has to offer. The theaters, the bathhouses. He's going to visit, politicians in Thebes. He's going to visit military leaders in Thebes and go through the process of discussing strategy and tactics. Okay, and those are two different things. Strategy is the overall way you win a war. What is the large plan? How do you put this together before the war even starts so that you can win? Tactics is what you do on the battlefield. How do you defeat the enemy army once you meet it there? And again, his imprisonment is not, constrictive at all. He has a house, he has a villa that he's living in, and he can leave at any time he wants. He's got an escort that usually goes with him, but he can go anywhere in the city, talk to anybody he wants in the city. So he's talking to philosophers and mathematicians and anybody and everybody that's there. But the people that he's really interested in talking to are the Theban generals and their hoplites, because they are the dominant military and political power at the time. And one of the things that the Thebans did in order to do that is backstabbing their neighbors, sometimes stabbing in the face, because they have a tendency of doing that. But they figured out how to beat the other phalanxes. Instead of only having 5 men spread throughout the entirety of a line that might be half a mile long, you have 5 men on most of your Theban line, and then one wing is what they call loaded. You put 20 or 30 men, over a space of maybe 50 feet. And you use that to hammer that other phalanx and crush one flank of it and then swing in and destroy the other part. Philip likes that. But he's looking at it as well. Three phalanxes are slow. They have a short range. He's going to go through the process of making those spears better. The other thing is he knows that the Greeks really don't rely on cavalry that much. And so in this case, this is, Philip, after he goes back to Macedonia, this is when he's starting his campaign against the Illyrians and then eventually the Greeks. Okay, he's on horseback. The men that are with him, those are Macedonian aristocrats. Okay, they're members of the nobility. So they help in ruling the country and later the empire, and they're also the officers that are in there. And you'll notice that in order to kind of show off that they are, the leaders in there, they have leopard skin as what they're using as the blanket, the saddle blanket as they go through. Okay, the cloaks they have are dyed. Okay, you'll notice that he's the only one that really has a large purple cloak. Purple is a royal color because purple dye is really hard to get in the ancient world. It only comes from the region of the city of Tyre on the Mediterranean coastline. To give you an idea of what a Greek phalanx looks like compared to a Macedonian one. Here's the classical Greek one. If you're lucky, you have the first three ranks with their spears presented, okay, towards the enemy. And then the other ones have their spears raised, and they're waiting for somebody in the front to be injured, and then somebody else moves up into their spot. You are basically protecting, okay, the person right next to you. Your shield overlaps with theirs. Greeks were highly sought after mercenaries. Okay, even in the Persian War, this is the part that's ironic with this. While the Greek city-states in the mainland are fighting for survival, you'll never guess who the Persians hire as mercenaries. Other Greek hoplites, because they're heavy infantry, and they're the only ones that can stand up to it. So again, the spear for the most part for a Greek hoplite is about 6 feet. Okay, and then they have their heavy shield that they have to hold in their left hand, regardless of whether you're left or right-handed. You're holding that damn spear in the right hand, and the left hand is the shield one. So it doesn't matter what your preference is as you go through. This is the Macedonian phalanx. Much deeper, okay, in terms of numbers of men who make it up, and then the sarissas, okay, those spears. Again, with the Greek one, they project maybe 3-4 feet maximum in front of the first hoplite. These are out anywhere from 10 to 15 feet ahead. Okay, and then what also happens is with the men who are in the back ranks, their sarissas are put at an angle so that if there are javelins or arrows being fired at the formation, the sarissas basically act like quills and knock those out of the sky before they can do that. That doesn't mean that once the Macedonians conquer, the Greek city-states, that these guys disappear. Alexander still takes them with him in his armies. They just serve on the flanks, or they're the rear line. Or sometimes, if he wants to punish them, they're the front line. So you get rid of them. And here's where, the story of Alexander's family just continues along the lines of horror. Alexander II finally kind of gets to a point where he's gotten rid of that pretender, he stabilized the northern border with the Illyrians, and then when he's getting ready to, perform a religious rite at a festival, as he's going there, he's assassinated by one of his officers, a man named Ptolemy, okay, who had been he had been an envoy that the Macedonians had sent to Athens, again, to try to get better relations with different city-states in Greece. When he came back, he was bribed, or he just decided that he was looking to take over the throne. He ends up killing him before he can get to the temple. Okay. And then you have the next, okay, brother come in, Perdiccas III. He's there, okay, from 365 to 360. Again, with him, he's also underage. And what happens is his brother's assassin Ptolemy is the regent. His brother's murderer is the one who is to reinforce this kid's reign. Thankfully, what happens is, okay, Perdiccas III has enough common sense, and there's enough people in the military and the court who are sensitive to the fact that they don't want to see him overthrown. They help him kill Ptolemy. Okay, in order that he can basically rule. And then what ends up happening with, Perdiccas III is, he gets rid of his brother's murderer. He establishes himself, he's gotten rid of all the pretenders. And he decides to launch, a raid of retaliation against the Illyrians. And what ends up happening is he and the army start marching out, and they get ambushed in one of those mountain valleys. He's killed. Most of the officers who are with him are killed. The soldiers who manage to survive flee back to Pella, and the kingdom of Macedonia, for the moment, does not have a ruler, because of the last of the royal princes is a hostage in Thebes. Thebes does not want to see their buffer, in the north collapse, and so they agreed to let Philip go, to not be king, but to be regent for his nephew, who is a child.
Not even a child, he's, I think, 10 months old.
Yeah. And the Macedonians are not really, how should I say this, creative when it comes to naming. Kind of like the English and the French and the Romans. There's only a few names that they stick with. And so this infant, Amyntas IV, is now the ruler. He is king, technically, ruling out of his bassinet, or whatever, the ancient world would be, as they go through there. And what ends up happening is Philip, he's an adult by this point in time. He goes back to Pella, and he is going to have to run the government and the military. He basically has to take what is left of the Macedonian army, reform it, to what he wants, beat the Illyrians, and then expand it. And then Philip has a question of, do I let this kid grow up enough to replace me, or do I, as the actual direct son of the king, or previous king, take over? And we'll leave it at that.
Yeah, spoiler for next week. He takes over.
But we're a couple minutes early, but it's kind of leaving. Oh, we're right on top of it. Well, okay. If you have any questions, comments, sarcastic remarks, we're here for it. If not, we will let you go, and we'll see some of you Wednesday, and I'll see others on Friday.
Yeah, right. And we'll see everybody in the week.
Yeah, we'll see everybody in a week.
Thank you all.
Thank you, everybody.
Yeah. Right, we'll get that, yeah. Okay.